Hey guys, what's crack-a-lackin'? I hope you guys are all doing well and that you're excited to watch this ed puzzle about our next unit. So our next unit, I'll talk about it in class a whole bunch, but it is about the living world. Okay, so we just talked about all the dead stuff, right? We talked about the geology, we talked about soil, we talked about mining, etc., etc. Now we're gonna get into the living stuff. So this really is one of my favorite units because we start out talking about ecosystems, we end up talking about nutrient cycles, evolution, biodiversity, how are all these amazing species on our planet now? And then we'll also talk about how humans are impacting those species. So off we go. Let's do this. Okay, so the first chapter that you guys are going to learn about is chapter 3 in your book, and it is called Ecosystem Ecology. One of the overarching themes in chapter 3 is that the components of an ecosystem are interrelated. So an ecosystem is a particular location on Earth that's distinguished by its particular mix of interacting biotic, so living, and abiotic components. All right, you need to be familiar with those two things and also this definition. So let's talk about a forest, for example, right? A forest has many interacting, living, or biotic components like trees. It has wildflowers, birds, mammals, insects, fungi, bacteria, etc. A whole bunch of stuff, right? These different interacting components look a lot different than what you might see in an ocean ecosystem. All of the living organisms in an ecosystem represent that ecosystem's biodiversity, okay? Variety of life in that ecosystem. We'll learn more about that. Ecosystems also have abiotic components or non-living components, right? That can be stuff like sunlight, it could be temperature, it could be soil, water, the pH, nutrients, all sorts of things like that. The abiotic components of an ecosystem are the things that determine what sort of organisms can live in that ecosystem. These components are dependent on climate, okay? So for example, if you have some place that is in the desert, let's just say Death Valley, California, they have temperatures that get really, really, really hot, right? Those are a lot different than the temperatures we have in Antarctica, all right, where temperatures can get as low as negative 85 degrees Celsius, okay? Also, the amount of water that these ecosystems have is drastically different. You may have very little to no water in a desert, but you may have a lot of water in a place like Antarctica, or at least frozen water. Regions with greater quantities of water in the soil can support trees and other plants, stuff like that, whereas regions with less water in the soil can only support grasses and small plants like that. Okay, let's go on. So let's talk about ecosystem boundaries, right? All of these abiotic and biotic components provide the boundaries that distinguish one ecosystem from another, okay? But there is a lot of gray space when we're talking about ecosystem boundaries. So some ecosystems have really well-defined boundaries, whereas others don't, right? So if we talk about a cave, for example, it's a very well-defined ecosystem. It has identifiable biotic components like animals and microorganisms, animals and microorganisms that are specifically adapted to live in that cave environment, right? They've evolved to be in that cave. But they also have a lot of distinct abiotic components, which could be the temperature, the salinity, the water that flows through the cave in an underground stream, et cetera, okay? An ecosystem like a cave is really easy to study because the boundaries are clear. Likewise, if we're talking about aquatic ecosystems like lakes, ponds, streams, or something like that, those are also relatively easy to define because the ecosystem's boundaries correspond to the actual boundaries between land and water, right? We know where the Gulf of Mexico is because it's where it switches from water to land. That's pretty simple. But a lot of times, especially when these ecosystems are on land, it's hard to figure out where one ecosystem ends and another begins, okay? So for this reason, and we'll talk about it in class, but ecosystem boundaries are sometimes subjective, right? An environmental scientist might define a terrestrial ecosystem as a range of a particular species of interest, such as the area where wolves roam, or they might define it using topographic features, such as two mountain ranges. Like that's the range of the ecosystem from one mountain range to the next. All right, so let's look at this. This is Yellowstone. This is what we call the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. How many of you guys have been there? Some of you maybe. It's super amazing. I hope that you get to go there someday, but it's a really, really cool place. Tons and tons of diversity and arguably one of the most unique places in the United States of America. So yeah, if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but we'll talk more about Yellowstone later in the year. Sometimes the boundaries of ecosystem are set according to administrative criteria instead of scientific criteria. Here's Yellowstone National Park. At one time, it was recognized as its own ecosystem until scientists began to realize that many species of conservation interest, like grizzly bears, spend time both inside and outside this 1 million hectare park. Okay, so to manage these species effectively, scientists had to think much more broadly, and they had to include nearly 20 million hectares of public and private land outside the park. So this larger region was named the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and just like the name says, the actual ecosystem itself extends well beyond the administrative boundaries of the park. So you can see the park here, right? The yellow part, it's a national park if you look at the key, but this dotted line here is showing the actual ecosystem boundary. So it's subjective, right? Not all the ecosystems that we'll talk about or that exist are as vast as this, Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Some can be really, really small. It could be an ecosystem that's in a fallen tree trunk, okay? Or it could be an ecosystem that's formed in an abandoned car tire that fills with rainwater. It can be anything like that, okay? Even though it's helpful for us to divide our locations on Earth into distinct ecosystems, it's important for us to remember that each ecosystem interacts with surrounding ecosystems through the exchange of energy and matter. Organisms such as bats fly to and from their cave, and chemical elements such as carbon or nitrogen dissolved in water move across these ecosystem boundaries. All right. So as a result, changes in any one ecosystem can ultimately have far-reaching effects on the global environment. In order to understand how ecosystems function and how to best protect and manage them, ecosystem ecologists don't only have to study the biotic and the abiotic components that define that ecosystem. You guys will have to have a really good understanding about these energy relationships, so let's talk about it in a little bit more detail in the next slides. Alrighty? Oh, jokes. I got jokes. Jokes for days. Okay, jokes, LOL. All right, what happens to a frog's car when it breaks down? You've probably heard this one before. It gets towed away. Oh, man, no, I'm too good. Okay, photosynthesis and respiration, y'all. Let's talk about producers. Think back to 9th grade biology. All right. Nearly all the energy that powers ecosystems come from the sun as solar energy. Y'all know that. Solar energy is a form of kinetic energy, right? Plants, algae, and other organisms use the sun's energy to produce usable forms of energy, and we call those peeps producers. All right. Another synonymous term that means the exact same thing as producers is an autotroph. Get those in your brain. Producer, autotroph, okay? Through the process of photosynthesis, these producers or these autotrophs are able to use solar energy along with carbon dioxide and water to convert that into glucose, right? Which is a form of potential energy that can be used by a wide range of organisms. One of the waste products that goes along with this process is oxygen. Okay, this is one of the reasons why plants and other producers are so beneficial to our atmosphere, because they produce the oxygen that we need to breathe, and they also take in carbon dioxide in order to make that glucose and that oxygen. Okay, so producers or autotrophs use the glucose they produce by photosynthesis to store that energy and build structures such as their stems, their roots, etc. Okay, other organisms like some of the herbivores and eat the tissues of producers and gain energy from the chemical energy contained in those tissues, okay? You're probably not used to thinking about eating as an actual chemical reaction, but that's exactly what it is, okay? But animals do that through cellular respiration, which is a process that unlocks the chemical energy stored in the cells of organisms, right? Respiration is just the opposite of photosynthesis. But basically, your cells take glucose and oxygen, and they convert that into energy, carbon dioxide, and water. Essentially, it's photosynthesis run backwards to recover the solar energy stored in glucose. Okay, that's exactly what we do. So let's talk about respiration. All organisms, including producers, carry out respiration to feed their own metabolism and to grow. Okay, producers both produce and consume oxygen. When the sun's shining and photosynthesis occurs, producers generate more oxygen via photosynthesis than they consume during respiration. So basically, there's a net production of oxygen, okay? At night, producers only respire, consuming oxygen without generating it. Overall, producers photosynthesize more than they respire. So you end up with this net effect, which is an excess of oxygen that's released into the air, and also an excess of carbon that's stored in the tissues of these producers. Okay, so here's a picture for you guys, or a diagram, I guess you could say. But as you can see here at the top, it says plants, algae, some bacteria, they all undergo photosynthesis. Okay, but, and this is a misconception I see a lot of the time in students, all organisms undergo respiration. Okay, it's not like producers undergo photosynthesis and everything else undergoes respiration, right? We just always relate producers to producing oxygen because overall they're photosynthesizing more than they're respiring, right? And the net effect is that excess of oxygen that's being released to the air and that excess of carbon that's stored in the tissue of the producers. Okay, so here you go. There's your formulas that you guys should be familiar with. So unlike producers, which make their own food, we have another word that you need to know, consumers or heterotrophs. This is all a review from 9th grade, okay? So we're going to become familiar with it again. But heterotrophs are incapable of photosynthesis, like I just said, and they have to obtain their energy by consuming other organisms. In the picture I'm going to show you on the next slide, you can see that the heterotrophs fall into several different categories, okay? So you've got heterotrophs that consume producers. We call those primary consumers, okay? Here are these two words. You guys need to be familiar with these and be able to distinguish between the two, all right? So here is a complex food web. So you can see the grass is being eaten by multiple species. One of the things here, and I will help explain this in class when you're doing your Gorangosa activity, is you have to make sure that the arrow is moving in the direction of the energy. So if, let's see the zebra, if the zebra eats the grass, that energy is moving from the grass to the zebra, right? When the lion eats the zebra, that energy is moving from the zebra to the lion, not vice versa, okay? People get this confused and they think because the lion's eating the zebra, the arrow should go towards it. That's probably the main thing I see go wrong with these food webs, but I'll correct that if I see y'all doing it in class, okay? But like I said, not all these organisms fit really nicely into a single trophic level or a single linear chain, right? Some organisms called omnivores can operate at several different trophic levels. Okay, so for example, an example of an omnivore would be a grizzly bear. Okay, grizzly bears eat berries and they also eat fish. Okay, the Venus flytrap, it can photosynthesize, but it can also digest insects that become trapped in its leaves. So it's really difficult to show those points just using a food chain. All right. In addition, each trophic level will eventually produce dead individuals and waste products, okay? Scavengers are carnivores that consume dead animals. So an example of this might be a vulture, it could be a hyena. Detritivores are organisms like earthworms and dung beetles that specialize in breaking down dead tissue and waste products into smaller particles. So these particles then can be further processed by decomposers. Right here, you've got your fungi and your bacteria that complete the breakdown process by recycling those nutrients from the dead tissues and waste back into the ecosystem, right, into that soil to make it all nice and healthy so we can grow plants big and strong. Okay, if we didn't have these three groups right here, right, the scavengers, the detritivores, and the decomposers, there would be no way of recycling organic matter and energy. And essentially, we would just fill up, the whole planet would fill up with dead plants and animals. So these guys are very, very important here and are definitely not given the credit that they deserve. Oh, man, I'm trying to find funny pictures. I saw this the other day, and I just thought it was so funny. So it's this little adorable little boy. He used a makeup app on my 1-year-old son, and it turned him into a strong, independent woman who don't need no man. Oh, man. Okay. Let's talk about ecosystem productivity. All right, so this is something that you probably haven't learned about before. I don't think you would have learned this in biology, but I'm not sure. So the amount of energy available in an ecosystem depends on how much life that ecosystem can support. For example, the amount of sunlight that reaches a lake's surface determines how much algae can live in the lake. Makes sense. And in turn, the amount of algae determines the number of zooplankton that the lake can support, and the size of zooplankton in that population determines the number of fish the lake can support, right? It's all connected. So if we wish So if we want to understand how ecosystems function or how we can manage and protect them, it's really important that we understand where the energy is in an ecosystem and how that's transferred through the food webs. Okay, so to do this, basically environmental scientists look at the total amount of solar energy that the producers in an ecosystem capture via photosynthesis over a given amount of time. All right. This measure, this term is known as the gross primary productivity of an ecosystem, otherwise known as the GPP, right? Note that the term gross as used here indicates the total amount of energy captured by producers, okay? In other words, the GPP does not subtract the energy lost from producers or respiration. The energy captured minus the energy required by producers is the ecosystem's net primary productivity, okay? So think of it like a paycheck. If some of you get a paycheck, you can ask your parents if you're confused about this. But when you get a paycheck, it will tell you the gross amount that your employer pays you, okay? This number usually looks really pretty and you're like, oh, heck yeah, look at all this money I'm gonna get. But after they take taxes out and stuff, that's your net primary productivity. You're not getting anywhere near that gross income, okay? Because they're still gonna take out 25, 30%, whatever it is. And then you're going to be broke again once you get that paycheck, right? So this is the NPP, the net primary productivity, okay? So the formula here is really simple. We're going to talk about it in class, so don't worry about it too much here. I'm not going to give you any questions, but your NPP, or your net primary productivity, is simply your gross primary productivity subtract the respiration by producers, okay? So we're going to talk about that in class. So if you're still a little confused about this, let me try to reword it in a different way, okay? So your GPP is essentially a measure of how much photosynthesis is occurring over some amount of time, okay? It's really difficult for scientists to determine a GPP because a plant rarely photosynthesizes without simultaneously respiring, right? But if we can determine the rate of photosynthesis and the rate of respiration, we can use that information to calculate GPP, okay? So scientists sometimes determine the rate of photosynthesis by measuring the compounds that participate in the reaction. Okay, so for example, we can measure the rate at which CO2 is taken up during photosynthesis, and also we can measure the rate at which CO2 is produced during respiration. Scientists can determine the rate of photosynthesis by measuring the compounds that participate in the reaction. Okay, so for example, we can measure the rate at which CO2 is taken up during photosynthesis and also the rate at which CO2 is produced during respiration. Okay, so try to pay attention because this might get a little confusing. A common approach that scientists take to measuring the GPP is to first measure the production of carbon dioxide in the dark. All right, because we know that no photosynthesis is happening in the dark, this measure allows scientists to eliminate the carbon dioxide uptake by photosynthesis. Okay, after they've done that, they can measure the uptake of carbon dioxide and sunlight together. Okay, that measure of carbon dioxide and sunlight gives the scientists the net movement of carbon dioxide when respiration and photosynthesis are both occurring. Okay, so by adding the amount of carbon dioxide produced in the dark to the amount of carbon dioxide taken up in the sunlight, scientists can determine the gross amount of carbon dioxide that's taken up during photosynthesis. So by using this method, we can figure out the GPP of an ecosystem per day within a given area. So the measurement of our net primary productivity allows us to compare the productivity of different ecosystems, and that's why we need to know this, right? So it's probably obvious to you guys that producers grow best in ecosystems where they have lots of sunlight, they have lots of water, they have lots of nutrients, and stuff like that. Warmer temperatures, so places like tropical rainforests, salt marshes, those are some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Conversely, if you're talking about places that don't have a lot of those things, like the Arctic, really dry deserts, dark regions of the deep sea, these have poor net primary productivity. Basically, the greater the productivity of an ecosystem, the more primary consumers can be supported, and therefore the population size could be bigger for those different trophic levels there on up. Another really good thing about measuring the net primary productivity of an ecosystem is that it allows us to measure changes in an ecosystem. So if we know that there's been a big change in the NPP from 1 month to the next or 1 year to the next, that tells us that maybe something is up, something has happened in that ecosystem to cause that change, so we can further investigate. So here's a diagram showing information about the GPP and the MPP, right? If you guys don't remember from biology, converting sunlight into chemical energy is not a very efficient process. So as you guys can see here in the figure, of the total amount of solar energy that reaches producers, only about 1% on average, that is converted into chemical energy via photosynthesis. So you can see right here, 99% of solar energy is reflected or passes through producers without being absorbed, okay? Only about 1% of solar energy striking the producer is captured by photosynthesis. Most of the solar energy that they're talking about here is lost from the ecosystem in the form of heat, and it returns to the atmosphere. Some of the lost energy might consist of wavelengths of light that producers can't absorb. Those wavelengths are either reflected or they're passed through their tissues, okay? So let's talk about this over here, right? The net primary productivity of ecosystems ranges from 25 to 50% of GPP, or it can be as little as 5% of the solar energy striking the plant. So obviously, based on these numbers, it takes a lot of energy to conduct photosynthesis. All right, so let's look at the math, right? On average, about 1% of the sun's energy that's captured by a producer, of that 1%, 60% is used to fuel the producer's respiration. So you can see right here, 60% of GPP is lost to respiration. Okay. The remaining energy down here is about 40% of that original 1%, right? This 40% can be used to support the producer's growth and reproduction, stuff like that. So if we're talking about, for example, a forest in North America, this forest might have a GPP of 2.5 kilograms and lose 1.5 kilograms a year to respiration by the plants in the forest, okay? Because NPP equals your GPP minus respiration, that means the NPP of this forest is 1 kilogram, all right? That means that the plants living in 1 square meter of forest will add 1 kilogram of carbon to their tissues every year by means of growth and reproduction. All right, so in this example, the NPP is about 40% of the GPP. So this is just showing the different net primary productivities among ecosystems. Some ecosystems that might have a high net primary productivity would be swamps and marshes, tropical rainforests, coral reefs, salt marshes. Things with low net primary productivity would be like the open ocean, deserts, tundra, stuff like that, places that don't have a lot of warmth, sunlight, soil with nutrients, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's talk about energy transfer, efficiency, and trophic pyramids. We're going to talk about that in class too. But the energy of an ecosystem can be measured in terms of biomass, which is the total mass of all living matter in a given area, minus the water, right? The net primary productivity of an ecosystem establishes the rate at which biomass is produced over a given amount of time. Okay, so to analyze the productivity of an ecosystem, scientists have to calculate the biomass of all individuals accumulated over a given amount of time. Okay, so the amount of biomass present in an ecosystem at a particular time is this vocab word you guys should be familiar with. It's called the standing crop. All right, it's important that we differentiate between standing crop, which is measuring the amount of energy in a system at a given time, from productivity, which is measuring the rate of energy production over a span of time. Another thing we have to talk about, we're almost done, is ecological efficiency. Okay, ecological efficiency is usually pretty low, right? It's going to range from something like 5 to 20% on average, but we just say usually about 10% across all ecosystems. In other words, of the total biomass available at a given trophic level, only about 10% can be converted into energy at the next trophic level. Okay, so we use this thing called a trophic pyramid to represent this distribution. All right, trophic pyramids tend to look similar across ecosystems. They're usually about this size. And we use this term called the rule of 10%, but it says that 10% of the energy moves up to the next trophic level, okay? So let's look at the Serengeti ecosystem again. That gives us a pretty good example of a trophic pyramid right here, right? The biomass of the producers is much greater down here than the biomass of the primary consumers, okay? And you can see the numbers. You have 10,000 joules of energy at the producer level, and 1,000 joules of energy up here at the primary consumer level, which is 10%. Okay, only 10% of that energy travels up the food chain. Also, the biomass of primary consumers is much greater than the biomass of secondary consumers. Okay, so this is much greater than this. Again, it's 10% of the energy here compared to down here. The flow of energy between the trophic levels helps us to determine the population sizes of the various species within each trophic level. So this flow of energy here in between the different trophic levels help us to determine the population sizes that we might have up the trophic level. Okay. If there are a lot of producers present, that means we might have a lot of primary consumers, and so on and so forth. Okay, so here's your riddle for the day. Let's see if y'all can figure it out. What word in the English language does the following? The first 2 letters signify a male. The first 3 letters signify a female. The first 4 letters signify a great, while the entire word signifies a great woman. What is the word? We will see if you can get it. I will tell you the answer in class. And that is all for today. I hope that you guys have a fabulous day. Happy homecoming, and we'll see y'all later. Bye.